All right. Well, just to kick things off, so there's a lot of different themes in the book, themes of money in politics and class politics versus identity politics, activists versus establishment. But one thing I wanted to just kind of kick off with is something that you've written about outside this book as well, which is the left's tendency to kind of eat its own. You gave some examples through the book of in the Sanders presidential campaign, his staff at one point, they had unionized and they wanted to go potentially on strike and make demands before, I think it was before Iowa. You talk about the Sunrise Movement. They had sort of an internal racial reckoning and all sorts of internal turmoil that caused them to be distracted as the Build Back Better bill, later the IRA, was being formulated. So sort of pulled them from having influence on that. You talked about women's rights organizations, some of the staff wanting to take the day off and process trauma after Dobbs was decided. So I'm wondering if you can just kind of start off with that and talking about what do you think causes that kind of dysfunction? And is that part of the general progressive wave that we've seen that helped bring the squad to the forefront? And where does it actually come from?
I mean, some of it comes from, in general, when momentum is slowing and when movements are in retreat, you start to see more infighting. Like, that's just a general kind of phenomenon. That wouldn't quite explain the Bernie Sanders situation in 2020 because he was kind of surging at that point. But in that case, it was, in some ways, it was a success story in the sense that you had this entire kind of push by a bunch of field organizers out in Iowa who were saying that they were going to go on strike for more time off leading up to the Iowa caucuses, which is kind of a weird and contradictory argument because your job kind of ends when the caucuses are over anyway. So like even if you won the right to have days off, you wouldn't have a job at that, after Iowa in order to like enjoy those days off. But because the Sanders campaign had been unionized and therefore had like processes in place where those grievances could be aired, they were aired among all of the workers, and they kind of took a vote and decided that we're not going to do this. And the workers kind of felt like there had been a democratic process, and so felt like they were heard. So some of it in these organizations comes from people just feeling like they're not heard. They don't have a way to make their grievances heard, make their grievances heard in a way that they feel is kind of respectful enough. And so then it winds up kind of being channeled into more destructive paths. Some of it is also just failures of leadership at organizations. The case I wrote about with the Dobbs decision was one of the rare ones where leadership kind of pushed back. You had this situation where, we know when Dobbs is coming down. They wanted, grief counselors and time to process and reduced workloads and other things to respond to the trauma of that ruling coming. And the leadership pushed back and said no. And that's rare. Like, too often, you've had, managers who operate out of fear of saying no, that they will then be accused of some type of aggression against somebody, and that they'll wind up then paying the price. So they allow kind of the institution to pay the price rather than absorbing the hit themselves. And in this case, no, we are an organization that is here to defend the rights of tens of millions of people whose rights are under direct assault right now. We need to come to work, and we need to fight harder on that day than we fight on any other day. So no, we're not going to do that. But in a lot of cases it doesn't work out. Like in the case of Sunrise, like that you mentioned, I write about how the White House was, it was like the peak moment of access for Sunrise with the White House, that everything, that all the power that they had built on the outside was now being exploited as the legislative process was underway. But the people who were supposed to be meeting with the White House instead were meeting often internally, trying to resolve whatever internal struggle sessions were underway.
Where do you think that comes from?
I mean, so like I said earlier, like some of it comes from just people feeling like crap, like people feeling like there's no point in anything, that there's no hope, that the ability to collectively create institutions that can fight and win change is gone or never was there. And so the institutions need to be upended from the inside and reformed or destroyed, and then on the ashes of that you'll build something better. Like I think so some of it comes from like just deep pessimism and deep fear.
But it's not something that we've seen in years past, right? Part of what I was wondering was,
well, you saw it in you saw it a lot in the 70s, which you could argue is something of, time never repeats itself, but 60s were a real surging time for left movements, and the 70s were a period of retrenchment, and that's when you saw the advent of what they called in feminist circles trashing, which is the same thing as canceling. Like it's the same phenomenon. Giant pile on, and the use and deployment of fancy words to browbeat people and discipline them, kind of within retrenching movements.
Yeah, part of what I was wondering was if it was connected to this rise in identity politics, especially in Sunrise. Specifically, you had talked about that there were people who were arguing that the organization needed to root out white supremacy at the top of the organization, which I think had been led at that point by a woman of color. Mm-hmm. And I know at the beginning of the book, you talk about the 2020 Democratic presidential primaries, right? It wasn't, or no, I'm sorry, it was 2016. But so you were talking about the Clinton campaign's desire to sort of neutralize the Sanders campaign, which was really rising up on a progressive class-based platform. And she decides at one point, or her campaign decides, to focus on issues of identity over class. They start accusing the Sanders campaign of being racist and misogynist, not outright accusing him, but accusing his supporters, derisively calling them Bernie bros. And you say at one point, the Clinton campaign's deft deployment of identity politics to detonate the Sanders campaign set off a chain reaction that will blow the lid off the Democratic coalition for years to come. Mm-hmm. Was this really the beginning of that kind of weaponization of identity politics, which I would agree with you has reverberated in the certainly the left straight through today?
You're always in trouble when you talk about beginnings, because you can always trace it back just a week before and the year before that and the year before that. But this definitely, I think, was a huge moment in it, that it elevated it to the very top of the priority and the conversation. Like this is a presidential campaign, and did it in a way that so many people understood to be cynical in real time that it really colored how people saw those conversations in the future. And so people know, once you start to believe that your opponents are cynically weaponizing something, you then are very comfortable cynically weaponizing it in response. And so it also then hurt kind of the ability of those issues to be taken on their own and to be taken seriously. Because when you weaponize something and you turn it into a cynical product, it's impossible to get people seriously, to get behind a coalition to take it seriously. So that decision, I think, did hypercharge a trend that was, I think, already underway.
Do you think educational polarization has played any part of that? This idea that the left, since the year 2000 at least, has become more, sort of the managerial class, the college-educated class. They go in to fill the rank and file, the party structures, the DNC. the nonprofits, the different advocacy organizations. And there's become this real divide, not just in the United States, in the Western world, of the left parties being sort of the more educated parties. And you start to see this sort of cultural divide between the left parties and the right parties, to the point where the working class is becoming more aligned with, the Republican Party in this country. Is that something that you think, was that woven into the Sanders sort of identity politics dynamics?
Yeah, I think so. The Democrats are a party that always, the one through line, well, it's a complicated party history, but a through line is standing up for the underdog, the little guy. And so, yeah, if you're going to polarize around education, and some of your coalition is going to be materially more well off than what you understand to be the little guy, then sometimes people need other costumes to put on so that they can still play the role of the little guy. So in that sense, I think you could see it. Plus, the language itself becomes a signifier of kind of in-group status. And in order to learn that language, you need to attend the institutions that are so conversant in it. So I think you're right. I think you don't get it without the education polarization. Yeah.
So you also talked a lot about the impact of money in politics post Citizens United, and I know you've talked in a lot of interviews for this book about AIPAC and Democratic Majority for Israel and a few other groups. Can you talk about the impact that they've had on Democratic Party politics in the last few years, and the impact that they're having on them right now?
I mean, the most vivid impact, the most obvious impact would be turning potential members of Congress into non-members of Congress. Like you would have in Congress now, if not for AIPACs or DMFIs spending against them. Nina Turner would be a member of Congress. Nida Olam, I think, would have won her race, a progressive woman running in North Carolina. Donna Edwards, a progressive woman running in suburban D.C. in Maryland, would have won. There are probably a handful of others, that win without, that amount of spending. And then across the board, for the most part, you had candidates, moderating their positions when it came to Israel-Palestine, to be sure, but also just being a little quieter about some of their Bernie adjacent politics. Like in 2018, every challenger was out there was competing to be the most Bernie, type of candidate, because that they felt like that was the path toward getting small donors and toward getting the kind of infrastructure of left groups that would put together, fundraisers and maybe even an independent expenditure on their behalf, and it would be a signal to voters like, I'm the most progressive candidate in the race, vote for me. By 2022, that putting your hand up and saying I'm going to be a member of the squad, I supported Bernie, I'm going to be a Bernie-like member of Congress, that was attracting the attention of DMFI and AIPAC before you said anything about Israel. There's a really interesting about John Fetterman in Jewish Insider, which covered all of these primaries very closely, which leads off by saying, John Fetterman has been heavily associated with the squad and with Bernie Sanders, which has led a lot of people in the pro-Israel community to worry that he shares their politics on Israel-Palestine. In fact, in an interview with Jewish Insider, he said nothing could be further from the truth. But so that showed you a bunch of different things at once. But one of the things it showed is that just the idea that you were aligned with Sanders and the squad was enough to raise extreme suspicions among AIPAC and Democratic Majority for Israel that you were also then going to be supportive of Palestinian rights, and so therefore needed to be targeted. So one response to that was, well, we'll just put out a statement that says I stand with Israel. But the other was that, do we really need to brag about how we previously said we were supportive of the Green New Deal and Medicare for All? Like, people get it. Like, let's be a little quieter about that, and that has that has an effect on the politics of the party then.
Yeah, so that's what I was going to ask about. So AIPAC, DMFI, in a sense, they're influencing the party not just on foreign policy, but on domestic policy as well. And so I was wondering, do you get a sense outside of the squad and outside of the hardcore progressives that this bothers anyone, that for someone like Nancy Pelosi, who's obviously very establishment and one of the biggest fundraisers in the party, but she's also been, a liberal Democrat for most of her life and argue, one of the most liberal leaders that we've had, at least since the Great Society. Do you think, does this bother any of them that it's impacting their domestic policy as well as their foreign policy?
I think not really. You see Mark Pocan, for instance, former chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, being extremely outspoken about the negative role AIPAC's playing in Democratic primaries. But in general, the incentives are pretty lined up. That Pelosi is herself hostile to. She's the most liberal speaker we've had, but she's also hostile to the kind of rhetoric that comes from the Bernie side. Like she's not here for Medicare for all. She's not here for the Green New Deal. She thought, as I write about in the book, she thought abolish ICE came from the Russians. Defund the police. I'm sure she has very strong opinions about. So, and certainly when it comes to like the more aggressive material stuff beyond Medicare for all, she thinks it goes too far. So, in a lot of ways, the incentives are lined up, and that's true also for the donors to Democratic Majority for Israel and AIPAC. That you're not giving $1 million check to an AIPAC super PAC without having lots of money to be able to spend, and you didn't get lots of money without having an interest in keeping the kind of current, policy structures in place that benefit people that are in the 1%. So it lines up.
And just an aside on the abolish ICE Russia thing, so that kind of stood out to me in the book when you had mentioned Pelosi said to someone that she thought it was the Russians who had injected that phrase into the body politic. I know you can't read her mind, but is your sense that Pelosi and or Democratic leadership actually believe that the Russians are interfering in this way? I wasn't sure if she was just saying that because has a lot of legs politically and sends a signal to Democratic voters, don't go with this, as a scare tactic, which can be very influential. But does she actually think the Russians are putting phrases like abolish ICE into the political conversation?
I think she does. I think that people would be surprised how little daylight there is between kind of the private views of somebody like Pelosi and an average but much less informed kind of MSNBC junkie. Like it's actually, she obviously knows a lot more. She gets intelligence briefings. She's living this stuff rather than watching it on TV. But yeah, I think she believes it.
Circling back to AIPAC, I assume that they are pretty professional in how they get donations and handle things and stuff like that. But could you not make an argument that this is foreign interference in U.S. elections? This is a lobby that it's for another country. It's heavily aligned with the Likud party in Israel. Again, I would doubt that they would be so sloppy as to be getting direct emails from Benjamin Netanyahu on what to do, but it otherwise feels like, if there was an equivalent of another country, say a Russian lobby, I think people would be pretty quick to accuse them of foreign interference in a very legal way. I don't see anything illegal about it.
So the key thing is, on the one hand, the money is American in the sense that, like you said, they're very careful. Like they're not going to take money from Israelis who don't have American citizenship, which you can't do. You can't, if you're a foreigner, you can't, spend. You're not supposed to spend in elections. Now they're actually, there are some foreign donors who've given to like major Democratic organizations and Republican ones that then go and do nonprofit work that then has effects on elections. It's controversial stuff, but the answer, that's the main reason why they don't get busted on that front. However, one of the things I reported in the book, which to me is fascinating and could be looked at more closely, Mark Mellman, the founder of Democratic Majority for Israel and an advisor to AIPAC, told me that one of the reasons that he fights so hard against the Squad and Bernie over here in the United States is that it makes it harder to accomplish what is his primary mission, which is to defeat Likud in Israel. Like he's an anti-Likud guy. He's a good liberal, wants to throw Netanyahu out of power, and he is a consultant, or it has been. I don't know if he is like to this day, but he may still be, to Yair Lapid, who was the head of the Yesh Atid party, who became prime minister actually for 6 months, a 6-month stretch in I think 2022 or 2021 or 2022. And he said that Netanyahu uses the American left and critics like AOC or Rashida Tlaib or Bernie to say, look how under siege Israel is. Everybody hates us. We're being isolated. You need to stand behind Likud and the Israeli right because we're the ones that are going to fight back against this. So he's set aside his analysis. He's saying that his work in the United States is for the benefit of Yesh Atid, his like client in Israel. So that does seem to me a case where you could make a plausible argument. Well, then, okay, you're working on behalf of Yair Lapid here in these elections, because Yair Lapid has a direct interest in seeing the left beaten, so there's no Israeli critics, and therefore then he can go and criticize Netanyahu and be taken more seriously in Israel. In the book, Yair Lapid even calls Steny Hoyer amid the Iron Dome vote. Like the reason they had that Iron Dome vote that became this kind of flashpoint was because Yair Lapid, who was the foreign minister, called Steny Hoyer and demanded it. So you can imagine why people from the outside would be like, wait a minute, don't you have to register here? Don't you have to register as a foreign agent in these cases? And I think one answer is like there's an exception. It's not an illegal exception, but there's kind of a cultural exception to the question of Israel. It's like, how dare you? Are you suggesting that Israel is a foreign country? It's like, I think it is. Isn't it? I think technically it is, right? So yeah, it's a really interesting question, but I think who on earth in our political system is in Department of Justice or wherever else is going to like take that up? You imagine?
That's a good point.
You imagine trying to put that on a Zoom schedule inside the DOJ?
Probably would not go well.
No.
I was trying to do the math on a lot of the figures that you reported in the book about the money that AIPAC and DMFI spent on going up against the Squad members in 2018, which is probably not that much. 2020, which is a bit more. In 2022, which was a lot. 2024, I'm sure you've seen recently, they're pledging, I think AIPAC alone pledging upwards of $100 million, which seems to far outweigh what they had spent previously against a relatively low number elected officials. And I know that the numbers in the Squad are kind of wishy-washy. There's the core four, and then, Jamal Bowman, who AIPAC seems to really have it out for. Yes. But is your sense, just from, I know you talk to them and have a sense of may have a sense of what they're thinking, is that scaring anyone? I mean, It feels like that would...
They're definitely scared. At some point, it becomes marginal, like the amount of money, because I think you count everything, you're usually at 40 million plus in 2022, and so the difference between 40 million and 100 million it's a lot. But like, if you're facing 40 million, you're already facing like it's just absolute avalanche of money. And so it's only marginally more difficult in some ways to beat 100 million than to beat 40 million. The 100 million is actually dicey when it comes to the sourcing. The original article, I think it was in Slate, said that informed observers, thought there could be, they could spend up to $100 million, which I think is plausible. And if they'd have to spend if 20, if they pick 20 races and spend $5 million in each race, like you're at $100 million, and there's certainly 20 races I could imagine them spending in, but no, that money has not has not been confirmed. We haven't seen that, but it's certainly plausible given that they spent nearly half that the cycle before, and that's before October 7th and before this war, and so. Yes, the answer is that they are very much paying attention. I mean, they were already paying very close attention. Now they're expecting, this wave of money. So, there are organized efforts among Justice Democrats and the Squad and the constellation of kind of allied groups to figure out how they can fend this off.
And are they? Do you know if they're being strategic about who they're going against? Because my assumption would be that AOC, for example, seems to have a pretty tight lock on her district, whereas someone like Jamal Bowman straddles both the Bronx and Westchester County, which is a bit more Jewish than the Bronx, and so it feels like it would have a little more fertile ground.
And also there's going to be redistricting. So if they can, and that's going to be a fight between his opponents and his allies. You could see that race decided based on how the lines are drawn, one way or the other. Yes, but they're going after Cori Bush. So it looks like Wesley Bell was persuaded one way or another to drop his Senate run and run for Congress instead against her. He's a fairly progressive guy, and a known quantity in St. Louis. So that's a really tough race for her. There have been those reports from two different people in Michigan that they were offered $20 million to drop out of races to run against Rashida Tlaib, and both said no. I think it's going to be a little bit of a challenge for them to beat Rashida, because in order to beat her, they'd have to say a lot of things that are super unpopular in her district. They almost beat Ilhan Omar in 2022. She held on by like 4 points. She has two opponents now, so unless they coalesce behind one, and now that she got caught off guard, she's paying much closer attention in 2024. I think Presley doesn't have a race. Summer Lee, they're gonna come for Summer Lee in Pittsburgh really hard. Be interesting to see if they try to come after Greg Casar down in Austin. It doesn't look like they will. And then you've got other candidates that they've kind of incumbents who they've kind of said things about, and you're wondering, like, are they gonna expand it to this? Like Hank Johnson, I think, in Georgia, fairly rank and file member. Bonnie Watson Coleman, a rank and file Democrat in New Jersey, who they've been somewhat critical of Israel recently, and you've seen DMFI make statements about them. It'd be very interesting to see if they went so far as to come after kind of rank and file Democrats who were critical of Israel. We'll see. But if you have that kind of money, it becomes easier to just take a shot at it.
Yeah, and just I think one more question about AIPAC, and it's similar to a previous question, but we talked about AIPAC kind of moving the party to the right on domestic issues as well as foreign policy. But you also talk about in the book that AIPAC had instances where it would jump into a Democratic primary to get its preferred candidate, but then either not participate in the general election altogether or potentially support the Republican candidate. And I would assume this would be something that would bother Democratic Party leadership, that it, in some examples, it's just putting in a more centrist sort of Israel hawk who's a Democrat, but in some cases it's taking out the Democrat and putting in a Republican. Yeah. I mean, are there any phone calls between Biden or Jeffries or Schumer, anyone in AIPAC weighing in on this?
Not that I've heard of, but you're right that's crossing a new line. And Summer Lee was the kind of funniest example, because they spent millions trying to beat Summer Lee in a Democratic primary in Pittsburgh, and their whole argument was that Summer Lee was not a good enough Democrat. They're questioning her Democratic bona fides. Like, she's been critical of Biden in the past. She ran with the DSA in 2018. She'd since abandoned her allegiance with them. But yeah, so she's not a good Democrat. So she wins the primary, and then in the general, they spent money for the Republican, trying to beat her in the general. It was like, wait a minute, you just spent the last several months telling us that your problem with her was that she wasn't a good enough Democrat. and now you're going to try to elect the Republican against her. I mean, not that anybody took their passion for the integrity of the Democratic brand seriously to begin with, since they endorsed like 110 Republicans who voted to nullify the election. So it's not exactly like they're a big Democratic partisan player to begin with. But yeah, no, I'm not aware of any phone calls. But I think if they did that at more scale, they would hear about it. But yeah, the other funny one was Elaine Loria. She won a seat in 2018, flipped a Republican seat in Norfolk, Virginia, and was one of the most outspoken defenders of Islam in her time in Congress, constantly going after the Squad or Rashida or Ilhan, sponsoring resolutions to condemn them or writing letters to the editor or going on CNN and bashing them. It was her main thing. And then she had a very tight race in 2022, and AIPAC did not lift a finger for her beyond just endorsing her. Didn't spend a dime, and she lost. And so you did see a lot of Democrats noticing that and being like, well, I don't want to be on their bad side, but apparently there's not a whole lot of upside in being on their good side.
So, one of the other themes in the book, obviously, the title is The Squad, is about the rise of the Squad and this energy from that activist base that was connected to the Sanders campaign and a few other movements. The kind of youth Gen Z vote right now is one of the most liberal generations we've ever seen on paper. And as I'm sure you know, there's this kind of false assumption that the youth is always liberal, but it isn't historically the case. I think Bush v. Gore, I think the youth vote went split down evenly. They were pro-Reagan. So we have, if you're a progressive and hoping for a better future, this seems to be very, very good news. But on the other hand, we've seen a lot of dysfunction within the youth. We talked about the kind of left eating its own institutionally among these organizations. And there also seems to be this kind of alienation from at least the Biden administration, which I think had preceded Israel-Gaza, that sort of drop off on support for the Biden administration. So I'm just wondering your thoughts on what do you see in the next couple of years with, Gen Z starting to get to that age where you vote more, which I guess is probably into your 30s and that sort of thing. Does this portend a leftward shift for the Democratic Party more than we've already seen, or is that...
It definitely shows that the structures are in place for a leftward shift, and a lot of that I think is material in the way that material and cultural. Not only does the Republican Party seem like against the material interests of an entire cohort that is having a much harder time getting ahead by paying off student loans and owning a house and doing just the basics of being able to start a family and live a decent life. At the same time, they see them as a bunch of bigots. They're even hostile to marriage equality. It seems like at some point, at some level, and so
the youth voters.
No, the Republicans, the youth voters.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, youth voters look at Republicans and they're like, these people are ridiculous. But we'll see how the Gaza campaign that Israel is waging plays into that. Since you asked about a couple years down the road, I think a lot remains to be seen. If Trump wins and brings in some reactionary dystopia, then you'll see a massive swing back toward Democrats. Because the structures are already there for it. But we'll see. Lots still up for grabs. Joe Biden has managed to kind of squander a historic amount of goodwill.
How do you think he's done that? On Israel?
I think some of it's Israel. Some of it, I think, is bad luck around the way that the inflation played, and I think he can recover from if the economy continues to wage growth with inflation staying low and unemployment staying under 4%. I think he would eventually get rewarded for that. But nobody's going to want to reward him when A, he's doing what he's doing with Israel, and B, he looks like he's 150 years old. I think that's a real thing. And he can't do anything about that except step aside. And it'd be interesting to see how a generic Democrat, like a J.B. Pritzker or somebody, would be received instead.
Yeah, another billionaire
Right.
coming in to rescue the Democratic Party. Do
Yeah.
you think the Gaza war will impact Biden in the election? I mean, on the one hand, the parallels to LBJ feel pretty strong with, I mean, his accomplishments, Biden's accomplishments legislatively, and then you talk in the book about, Elizabeth Warren's mantra that personnel is policy, and he's done a great job, arguably, with Lena Khan and a lot of the antitrust work, which has been really successful lately, just stacking the NLRB, obviously, and then the IRA, the infrastructure bill, his initial COVID bill. So just arguably one of the most accomplished Democrats of the post-60s period, which I guess we've only had 3 Democrats, excluding him, since. But on the other hand, I mean, it's just a disaster on foreign policy, specifically Israel and Gaza. And it's hard to think this is all just going to be gone by Q1 or Q2 next year. I mean,
Right.
even if Israel stops the slaughter,
It could be a lot worse, right? The conditions could continue to just get worse. Like the big problem comes in the fact that the people who are most likely to be outraged about this are the ones who follow politics the closest, who follow global affairs closest. Those people are the ones that, then kind of transmit the vibes and political information in their social circles. It's like, oh yeah, my cousin who's the junkie is sharing this, and so people then kind of absorb that, through. So even if they only add up to 1 million or 2 people, they influence tens of millions of people in a kind of nebulous way. So I think it also makes it harder for other people to trumpet like some of his other achievements, because it's very hard for people to say to celebrate like wage gains while on the other hand there's a genocide. Like it's just a very difficult thing for so many people to get past.
Going back to the squad, one of the things that you talked about specifically with AOC was this kind of tension between being the outsider who's pushing and the insider who's kind of following the rules and doing procedural votes that might annoy the base and things like that. Do you think there's a risk, given how young a lot of them are, especially AOC, that the longer you stay in office, the more kind of compromised you become and less in touch with what the base is pushing on?
I think that's a risk for everybody, including journalists and politicians and everybody. And I think that they're probably aware of that, and constantly, trying to, you have to fight to, remind yourself of where you came from and who you represent. And I think they try to do that. It's it's difficult when you're when you start moving in these rarefied circles constantly, but so yeah, I think that's a real thing.
Is there a chance that AOC could be elected statewide to a Senate seat in New York? Do you think she has that kind of support upstate?
I think she could, and also like our system is so partisan that if she can just win the nomination, then she's going to win the general. Even people upstate who don't like her would probably prefer her to a Republican. And Bernie, I think, showed that if you can push past some of the misogyny or the racism, that his agenda can really be successful with working class people. But he was always more popular upstate than she was, even though their politics were like identical. And so it shows that there's a path, but that it's laden with difficulties.
One other interesting thing I thought about the squad is, especially it was talked about in your book, was, again, going back to the beginning of that Sanders versus Clinton, class versus identity. The squad seemed to marry the two, that they could talk about identity politics, about racial and gender politics, while also advocating for class-based issues. And they all kind of came from the Sanders wing of the party. But you had also talked about, and we had talked about a little bit earlier, of the downfalls of overly woke politics, the way that certain voters are turned off by overstressing identity, and that kind of almost like woke language that becomes very insular and almost a signal of a kind of class on its own, and that connects to the educational polarization. And so I wonder, is there a chance that the squad, I don't know, kind of sinks on its own because if it's over, it sort of loses touch with that working class element because it falls too much into the woke, what Carville called the Harvard faculty lounge language, where they're more conversant with university officials than they are with working class voters in Vermont or Texas or West Virginia.
I think that's always a risk, but I also think that these are politicians and they're going to follow, like, they're not the only, we're not the only ones who are aware of this phenomenon. And I think that you're seeing some of that element of the party in retreat a little bit in the last couple of years. And, to the extent that some of that language is useful to advancing their broader kind of left agenda, they're going to embrace it. The second that it gets in the way of it, they're not going to embrace it for the sake of just embracing it. And so, I think that the more talented among them are going to be able to kind of reinvent the language that's needed to do what I think really is their end goal, which is building a genuine kind of multiracial working class, movements, coalition that's capable of taking on big money. I don't think that, I think some institutions and some activists, could get dragged down to the bottom of the sea by that stuff. But in general, I think politicians won't, because politicians just in general are more deft at kind of riding waves rather than being kind of smashed by them.
Well, let's hope so. Ryan, thank you for joining the program. I know you've got a very busy schedule, probably a very busy day, but really appreciate it. Appreciate the book.
All right. Thanks, man.
All right. Thanks, Ryan. Take care.